The autumn wind carried the scent of dying grass across the vast expanse of Montana prairie. But Thomas Mackenzie couldn't smell it anymore. He couldn't feel the bite of the cold air against his weathered face or hear the familiar creaking of the old windmill that had stood sentinel over his ranch for 37 years. All he could feel was the weight of the rope in his calloused hands and the crushing emptiness that had consumed his chest since the day they lowered Sarah's casket into the frozen ground. The old oak tree behind the barn had been Sarah's favorite spot. She used to sit beneath its sprawling branches with her morning coffee, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Now it would serve a different purpose. Thomas had already thrown the rope over the strongest branch, the one that had supported their children's tire swing decades ago when laughter still echoed across these fields. But fate had other plans. As Thomas prepared to step off the wooden crate he'd positioned beneath the noose, a sound pierced through his despair, a sound so faint and desperate that for a moment he thought his grief-stricken mind was playing tricks on him. It was the muffled cry of a child, coming from somewhere beneath the earth of his own pasture. What Thomas Mackenzie discovered in the next few minutes would not only save his life, but reveal a horror so profound that it would shake the very foundations of their small Montana community and force him to become the hero he never knew he could be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of November 15th, 1923, dawned gray and bitter across the Mackenzie Ranch, located in the remote valley of Stillwater County, Montana. Thomas Mackenzie stood at the kitchen window of the farmhouse he had built with his own hands 40 years earlier, staring out at the 2,000 acres of land that had once represented hope, prosperity, and the American dream. Now it felt like nothing more than a vast graveyard of memories. At 62, Thomas was a man carved from the harsh Montana landscape itself. His face bore the deep lines of someone who had spent decades battling elements that showed no mercy, blizzards that could bury a man alive, droughts that turned fertile soil to dust, and cattle diseases that could wipe out a life's work in a matter of weeks. His hands, permanently stained with dirt and scarred from countless encounters with barbed wire and ornery livestock, had built everything on this ranch from the ground up. But those same hands trembled now as he poured his morning coffee, spilling the dark liquid across the worn wooden table where he and Sarah had shared breakfast for 38 years of marriage. The cup felt impossibly heavy, just like everything else in his world since the consumption had taken his beloved wife 3 months ago. Sarah Elizabeth Mackenzie had been the light that made every hardship bearable. She had arrived in Montana as a young schoolteacher from Boston, drawn by advertisements promising adventure and opportunity in the Western Territories. What she found instead was a stubborn rancher who barely knew how to read, let alone court a refined Eastern lady. But Sarah had seen something in Thomas that even he didn't know existed, a gentleness beneath the rough exterior, a capacity for love that ran as deep as the mountain streams that fed his land. Their courtship had been awkward and sweet, conducted through stolen glances at church socials and carefully chaperoned walks along the creek that bordered the eastern edge of his property. When Thomas finally worked up the courage to propose, he did so with a ring carved from a piece of Montana agate and words that tumbled out like water from a broken dam. Sarah's yes had been the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. They had built their life together with the same determination that Thomas used to tame the wild land. The farmhouse rose board by board, each nail driven with love and hope for the future. Sarah had insisted on a large kitchen where she could feed not just their family, but any neighbor who might need a meal. The front porch wrapped around 3 sides of the house because she wanted to be able to watch the sunrise from the east and the sunset from the west, claiming that no day should pass without witnessing both of God's daily miracles. Their children had come in due time. First Robert, strong and serious like his father, then the twins Mary and Martha, who inherited their mother's quick wit and kind heart, and finally little James, the surprise baby who arrived when Sarah was 38 and brought joy that seemed to overflow. From every corner of the house, the ranch had prospered during those golden years. Thomas's cattle were known throughout the territory for their quality, and his horses had a reputation for being both strong and gentle. He employed 12 men during peak seasons, and the bunkhouse Sarah had insisted he build was always full of laughter and stories. She made sure the hired hands were fed as well as family, and many of them stayed for years, becoming part of the extended Mackenzie clan. But Montana was unforgiving to those who loved too deeply, and tragedy began to stalk the Mackenzie family like a patient predator. The influenza outbreak of 1918 took both twins within a week of each other. Thomas still remembered the sound of Sarah's sobs echoing through the house as they buried their daughters side by side in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch. The light in her eyes dimmed that autumn, though she tried to hide her grief behind a brave smile. Robert left for France with the American Expeditionary Forces and never came home. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous boy from town who couldn't meet Sarah's eyes as he handed her the official notification. "Killed in action at Below Wood," the message read, as if those 5 words could somehow capture the loss of a young man who had planned to expand the ranch and fill it with children of his own. James lasted until his 20th birthday before the same restless spirit that had claimed his brother drove him to seek his fortune in the California oil fields. His letters became less frequent, then stopped altogether. The last they heard, he was somewhere near Bakersfield, working for a drilling company and talking about striking it rich. That was 2 years ago, and Thomas knew in his heart that his youngest son was probably dead. Though they'd never received official word. Sarah had borne each loss with the quiet strength that had first attracted Thomas to her. But the grief accumulated like snow on a mountain slope, building pressure until the inevitable avalanche. The consumption that finally claimed her seemed almost like mercy after watching her fade away piece by piece, though Thomas would have given anything to have her back. Even sick and suffering, the funeral had been attended by half the county, a testament to the lives Sarah and Thomas had touched over the decades. But as the mourners dispersed and the casseroles stopped arriving, Thomas found himself alone in a house that felt like a mausoleum. Every room held memories so vivid they felt like physical presence, Sarah humming while she kneaded bread, children's voices echoing from the front porch, family gatherings around the piano that now sat silent and gathering dust. The ranch continued to function because the routines were so deeply ingrained that Thomas could perform them without conscious thought. He fed the cattle, mended fences, and checked water levels with the mechanical precision of a man going through the motions of living without actually being alive. His remaining hired hands, loyal men who had worked for him for years, tried to engage him in conversation, but Thomas found words increasingly difficult to form. What was there to say? That everything he had worked for felt meaningless without Sarah to share it with. The financial pressures only made his despair worse. The post-war economic depression had hit Montana ranchers particularly hard, with cattle prices dropping to levels that barely covered feed costs. The bank in Billings had been understanding during Sarah's illness, allowing Thomas to defer payments on the mortgage he'd taken to expand the operation during better times. But patience had its limits, and the letters from the bank were becoming increasingly urgent. Thomas had always been a proud man, someone who paid his debts and kept his word. The thought of losing the ranch, the land where Sarah was buried, where his children had grown up, where every fence post and water trough represented years of backbreaking labor, felt like the ultimate betrayal of everything they had built together, yet he couldn't summon the energy to fight anymore. The spark that had once driven him to work 18-hour days and face down rustlers and wild animals had died with Sarah. The isolation didn't help. The Mackenzie Ranch sat in a remote valley, accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable during bad weather. The nearest neighbors, the Peterson family, lived 12 miles east, and the town of Cedar Falls was a 20-mile ride through country that could turn hostile without warning. During Sarah's lifetime, this isolation had felt like paradise, a private kingdom where they could build their dreams without interference. Now it felt like a prison where Thomas was trapped with his memories and regrets. He had started drinking more heavily after the funeral, something he'd never done during Sarah's lifetime out of respect for her feelings about alcohol. The whiskey didn't ease the pain, but it blurred the sharp edges of memory and made sleep possible when grief would otherwise keep him awake all night. The bottle on the kitchen counter was his constant companion now, a crutch that helped him stumble through each endless day. The hired hands had begun to look at him with concern, and Thomas knew they were talking among themselves about his deteriorating condition. He caught fragments of their conversations, worried murmurs about whether he was eating enough, whether he was keeping track of the business, whether they should contact his remaining relatives back east. Their loyalty touched him, but it also felt like another burden. These men depended on him for their livelihoods, and he was failing them just as he felt he had failed everyone else who had ever counted on him. On this particular morning, as November wind rattled the windows and reminded him that winter was approaching with its promise of isolation and hardship, Thomas Mackenzie made a decision that felt both terrible and inevitable. He couldn't continue living this half-life, going through the motions of existence while feeling nothing but emptiness inside. Sarah was gone, his children were gone, and the ranch that had once been their pride and joy was slipping away despite his best efforts. The rope had been hanging in the barn for years, used for everything from tying down loads to leading stubborn cattle. But as Thomas coiled it and tested its strength, he knew it would serve one final purpose. The old oak tree behind the barn was sturdy enough to support his weight, and its location would spare the hired hands the trauma of discovering his body during their morning rounds. He wrote 3 letters at the kitchen table, his handwriting shaky but legible. The first was to his lawyer in Billings, instructing him to sell the ranch and distribute the proceeds among the faithful workers who had stood by him through the difficult times. The second was to his sister Margaret in Boston, apologizing for the pain his decision would cause and asking her to arrange for his burial next to Sarah. The third was the hardest, a letter to James, if he was still alive somewhere in California, explaining that his father had simply run out of the strength needed to keep fighting. As he sealed the letters and placed them prominently on the mantelpiece, Thomas felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The decision was made, and soon the grinding weight of grief and responsibility would be lifted from his shoulders. He would be with Sarah again, and the ranch could pass to someone with the energy and hope needed to restore it to its former glory. He pulled on his heavy coat and hat, picked up the rope, and walked toward the barn with steady steps. The wind had picked up, and dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising the season's first serious snow. It seemed fitting somehow that his final act would take place as winter closed its grip on the land he had loved for so many decades. The old oak tree stood exactly where it had for over a century, its massive trunk scarred but unbroken by the countless storms it had weathered. Thomas fashioned the noose with hands that remembered the skill from his younger days working cattle, when every rancher had to be proficient with rope and knot. He tested the branch's strength, found it more than adequate, and positioned the wooden crate he would use to reach the proper height. As he slipped the noose around his neck and prepared to kick away the crate, Thomas closed his eyes and tried to summon Sarah's face one last time. But instead of his wife's gentle features, what came to his mind was the sound that had haunted his dreams for weeks, a faint crying that seemed to come from the earth itself, as if the land were mourning alongside him. He had dismissed it as imagination, the product of grief and too much whiskey. But now, standing on the edge of eternity, the sound seemed louder and more distinct. It was definitely a child's voice, weak and desperate, calling for help from somewhere beneath the frozen ground of his own pasture. Thomas hesitated, one foot poised to kick away the crate. The rational part of his mind insisted it was just the wind, or perhaps an animal caught in a trap somewhere. But the sound came again, unmistakably human and filled with terror that cut through his own despair like a knife. With shaking hands, he removed the noose and climbed down from the crate. If children were in danger on his land, he couldn't abandon them, no matter how much he wanted to escape his own pain. Sarah would never forgive him for walking away from innocence in need, and somewhere in the depths of his grief-numbed soul, Thomas Mackenzie found a spark of the man he used to be, the man who had never walked away from anyone who needed help. Following the sound across the frost-covered grass, Thomas began the journey toward a discovery that would change not only his life but the lives of 7 children who had been buried alive and left to die in the remote Montana wilderness. The rope lay forgotten beneath the oak tree as destiny pulled him toward a horror and a redemption he could never have imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The crying grew stronger as Thomas approached the eastern pasture, each step taking him further from the oak tree and the escape he had planned. His boots crunched through the thin layer of frost that covered the grass, and his breath formed small clouds in the bitter November air. The sound was definitely coming from underground, somewhere near the old creek bed that had dried up during the harsh summer drought. Thomas knelt in the frozen earth, pressing his ear to the ground like he'd seen Indian scouts do in his younger days. The crying was clearer, now not one voice, but multiple children calling out in weak, terrified whispers. His heart hammered against his ribs as the full horror of what he was hearing began to sink in. Someone had buried children alive on his property, and from the faintness of their voices, they didn't have much time left. "Hello," he shouted toward the ground, feeling foolish but desperate to establish contact. "Can you hear me? I'm going to help you." A chorus of weak responses came from below, confirming his worst fears. There were definitely multiple children down there, trapped in what must be some kind of underground chamber or root cellar. Thomas ran back toward the barn, his aging legs pumping with an energy he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. For the first time in months, he had a purpose beyond his own grief-innocent lives that depended on him. In the barn, Thomas gathered every tool he could carry: shovels, pickaxes, rope, and the coal oil lanterns they used for night work. His hired hands, Jake Morrison and Pete Sullivan, were just returning from checking the northern fence line when they saw their boss loading tools into a wheelbarrow with frantic urgency. "Mr. Mackenzie?" Jake called out, dismounting from his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent 40 years in the saddle. "What's got you all fired up? You look like the devil himself is chasing you." "Children," Thomas gasped, still out of breath from his sprint to the barn. "There are children buried alive in the east pasture. I can hear them crying from underground." Pete Sullivan, a grizzled old cowboy who'd worked for the Mackenzie family for over 15 years, exchanged a worried glance with Jake. They'd both been concerned about their boss's mental state since the funeral, and this sounded like the kind of thing a grief-stricken man might imagine. "Now, Mr. Mackenzie," Pete said gently, "you've been under a lot of strain lately. Maybe you ought to come inside and—" "Damn it, Pete." Thomas exploded with a fury that surprised all 3 men. "I know what I heard. There are children dying on my land while we stand here talking. Now either help me dig them out or get the hell out of my way." The raw desperation in Thomas's voice convinced both men that whether real or imagined, their boss believed completely in what he was saying. Jake grabbed a shovel from the tool rack while Pete collected rope and additional lanterns. If Thomas Mackenzie said there were children to be saved, they would dig up half of Montana to find them. The 3 men hurried back to the pasture, where the crying had grown noticeably weaker. Thomas directed them to the spot where the sound seemed strongest, a slightly raised area near an old cottonwood stump that marked where the creek had once carved its deepest channel. The ground here was different from the surrounding soil, less compact, as if it had been disturbed and refilled recently. "There," Thomas pointed with his shovel. "Start digging right there. Be careful, we don't know how deep they are or how much air they have left." The three men began excavating with the systematic efficiency of workers who had spent their lives moving earth. Jake and Pete had initially harbored doubts about their boss's claims, but those doubts evaporated when they had dug down only 3 feet, and their shovels struck something that definitely wasn't natural soil. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, brushing dirt away from what appeared to be a wooden board. "There's something down here, all right." They had uncovered the edge of what looked like a hastily constructed wooden box or crate, approximately 8 feet long and 4 feet wide. Air holes had been drilled through the top in a rough pattern, and faint light from their lanterns revealed the gaps where the boards didn't quite meet. As they cleared more dirt away, the children's voices became clearer and more desperate. "Please help us," came a young girl's voice from inside the makeshift coffin. "We can't get out. Sarah's hurt real bad, and baby Tommy ain't moving much anymore." Thomas felt ice water flow through his veins at the mention of names that belonged to children he didn't recognize. These weren't local kids from Cedar Falls. He knew every family within 50 miles of his ranch. Someone had brought these children here specifically to bury them alive, choosing his remote property because they thought no one would find them in time. "We're getting you out," Thomas shouted toward the air holes. "How many of you are down there?" "7, came the weak reply. "Me and my brothers and sisters. The bad men said we were going to see our mama and papa, but then they put us in this box and covered us up with dirt." The full horror of what they were uncovering began to dawn on the 3 men. This wasn't an accident or some children's game gone wrong. This was attempted murder on a scale that defied comprehension. Someone had kidnapped 7 children and buried them alive, intending them to die slowly and horribly in the Montana wilderness. "Pete," Thomas ordered, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him, "ride back to the house and bring every blanket you can find. These children are going to be half frozen when we get them out. Jake, help me clear the rest of this dirt away." As they worked to expose the entire wooden crate, more details of the children's ordeal became clear. The box had been carefully constructed with just enough air holes to keep the occupants alive for several days, suggesting that whoever had done this wanted them to suffer before dying. Food and water containers had been placed inside, indicating this wasn't meant to be a quick death, but a prolonged torment. The psychological cruelty of it made Thomas's blood boil. As a father who had lost his own children, he couldn't comprehend the evil that would deliberately harm innocents this way. His earlier despair was rapidly being replaced by a cold fury that gave him strength he didn't know he still possessed. When they finally cleared enough dirt to access the wooden lid, Thomas could hear the children more clearly. There were definitely 7 distinct voices, ranging from what sounded like a teenage girl down to a toddler who was crying weakly. The oldest girl seemed to be trying to keep the others calm, singing lullabies in a voice that cracked with exhaustion and terror. "We're about to open the lid," Thomas called down to them. "Move away from the top if you can, and cover your faces. There's going to be a lot of dirt falling down." Jake and Pete positioned their pry bars at opposite ends of the wooden cover, while Thomas held a lantern to provide light. The lid was secured with several nails, but the wood was green and hadn't been properly cured, making it easier to break apart. As they worked, Thomas found himself praying for the first time since Sarah's funeral, not for his own salvation, but for the lives of the innocents trapped below. The lid came away with a splintering crack that sounded like breaking bones in the cold air. Immediately, a wave of stench rose from the opening, the smell of human waste, vomit, and the sickly sweet odor of infection. Thomas held his breath and aimed the lantern down into the makeshift grave. What he saw nearly broke his heart. 7 children, ranging in age from perhaps 15 down to a toddler who couldn't be more than 2 years old, were huddled together in the cramped space. They were filthy, terrified, and obviously suffering from exposure and dehydration. The oldest, a girl with long brown hair matted with dirt and tears, held the youngest child protectively while 4 other children clustered around them. But it was the 7th child that made Thomas's hands shake as he held the lantern. A boy of perhaps 10 years old lay motionless against one wall of the makeshift coffin, his face pale and his breathing so shallow it was barely visible. Blood had seeped through a crude bandage wrapped around his head, and Thomas could see that the child was gravely injured. "Don't be afraid," Thomas called down to them, his voice as gentle as he could make it, despite the rage burning inside him. "We're here to help you. I'm going to come down and lift you out one at a time." The rescue operation that followed tested every skill Thomas had learned in 40 years of ranching. The hole was too narrow for a grown man to climb down safely, so they had to fashion a rope harness system to lift each child to safety. Pete had returned with blankets and hot coffee from the house, and they wrapped each rescued child immediately to prevent shock from the sudden temperature change. The oldest girl came up first, clutching the toddler who had been too weak to climb into the harness alone. Her name was Rebecca Patterson, and she was 14 years old. Between chattering teeth, she managed to tell Thomas that she and her siblings had been traveling with their parents from Kansas to Oregon when their wagon train was attacked by men claiming to be U.S. Marshals. "They said our pa was wanted for stealing horses," Rebecca whispered as Pete wrapped her in a heavy wool blanket. "But pa never stole nothing in his life. They shot him and mama right in front of us, then put us in this box and said we'd be joining them soon." The other children came up one by one: Michael, age 12, twins David and Daniel, both 8, Mary, age 6, and little Tommy, the 2-year-old who was so dehydrated he could barely cry. Each child brought fragments of the same horrific story: their parents murdered, their wagon train attacked by men who wore badges but acted like bandits, the most seriously injured child, the 10-year-old boy named Samuel, required special care to lift from the makeshift grave. The head wound was clearly serious, and Thomas feared they might be too late to save him. But as they brought him into the lantern light, the boy's eyes fluttered open, and he whispered a single word that chilled Thomas to the bone: "Marshall." As they carried the children toward the warm house, Thomas's mind was already working through the implications of what he'd discovered. 7 children, buried alive by men claiming to be federal law enforcement. A wagon train attacked and destroyed for no apparent reason except to steal whatever valuables the travelers might have been carrying. And most disturbing of all, the calculated cruelty of burying the children alive rather than simply killing them outright. This wasn't random violence or even common robbery. This was organized evil, carried out by people who either wore badges legitimately or had access to convincing forgeries. Either way, it meant that the danger to these children, and to Thomas himself, was far from over. The men who had done this wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who interfered with their plans. But as Thomas looked at the 7 rescued children huddled around the warmth of his kitchen stove, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: a sense of purpose that transcended his own grief. These children had been given to his care by divine providence or random chance, and he would protect them with his life if necessary. The rope still hung from the oak tree behind the barn, but Thomas Mackenzie was no longer the broken man who had planned to use it. He had found something worth living for in the most unexpected place, and he would not let evil triumph while he still drew breath. The real fight was just beginning. The Mackenzie farmhouse hadn't heard children's voices in over 5 years, but now it buzzed with activity as Thomas and his hired hands worked to care for 7 traumatized youngsters. Sarah's old sewing room was quickly converted into a makeshift infirmary, while the large kitchen became a refuge where the children could stay warm and begin the long process of healing from their ordeal. Dr. William Hensley arrived from Cedar Falls just after nightfall, his black medical bag in hand, his face grim with concern. Thomas had sent Jake Morrison on his fastest horse to fetch the doctor, knowing that young Samuel's head injury required professional attention that none of them could provide. Dr. Hensley was a man in his 50s who had seen his share of frontier violence, but even he was shaken by the condition of the rescued children. Severe dehydration across the board, Dr. Hensley muttered as he examined each child by lamplight. Exposure, malnutrition, and psychological trauma that will take months to heal. The boy Samuel has a serious concussion, possibly a skull fracture. He needs constant monitoring for the next 48 hours. Rebecca Patterson, the 14-year-old who had kept her siblings alive through their underground ordeal, refused to leave Samuel's side as Dr. Hensley cleaned and bandaged the boy's head wound. Her protective instincts had been sharpened to a razor's edge by the responsibility of caring for 6 younger children, and she watched every move the doctor made with suspicious eyes. "He's going to be all right, isn't he?" Rebecca whispered, her voice hoarse from days of calling for help in the buried coffin. "I promised Mama I'd take care of them all, and I can't. I can't lose Samuel, too." Thomas felt his heart clench as he listened to Rebecca's words. This child had been forced to carry burdens that would crush most adults, and she still thought her family's survival was her responsibility alone. It reminded him painfully of how he had felt after losing his own children, the crushing weight of believing he should have been able to protect them somehow. "Your mama would be proud of how you've cared for them," Thomas said gently, kneeling beside Rebecca's chair. "But you're not alone anymore. Dr. Hensley is the best doctor in 3 counties, and we're all here to help you now." As Dr. Hensley continued his examinations, the full scope of the children's ordeal began to emerge through fragments of conversation and careful questioning. The Patterson family had been part of a larger wagon train heading west from Kansas, searching for new opportunities in the Oregon Territory. Their father, Joshua Patterson, had been an honest farmer who had sold his land to finance the journey west for his growing family. The attack had come without warning on a cold morning 3 weeks ago, just as the wagon train was preparing to cross into Montana Territory. Men wearing federal marshal badges had ridden into camp claiming they had warrants for several members of the party, including Joshua Patterson. When Joshua protested his innocence and demanded to see the paperwork, the situation escalated rapidly into violence. "They shot Papa first," Michael Patterson, the 12-year-old boy, told Thomas in a voice that cracked with barely controlled emotion. "Didn't even give him a chance to read the warrant they claimed to have. Then when Mama started screaming, they shot her too. Said it was resisting arrest." The fake marshals had systematically looted the wagon train, taking everything of value, while claiming it was evidence in a federal investigation. The other families had been too terrified to resist, and most had fled into the wilderness rather than risk sharing the Pattersons' fate. The children had been kept alive initially because one of the false marshals had suggested they might be valuable as hostages or for other unspeakable purposes. But then the leader, a man with a big scar across his face, said they were too much trouble to keep, Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger as she forced herself to remember details that might help identify their attackers. "He said burying us alive would be more fun than just shooting us, and it would give them time to get far away before anyone found the bodies." Thomas exchanged meaningful glances with Jake and Pete. This wasn't random frontier violence, it was organized crime masquerading as law enforcement. The systematic nature of the attack, the use of federal badges, and the calculated cruelty suggested a group that had perfected these tactics through repeated use. How many other wagon trains had been attacked this way? How many other families had simply disappeared into the vast wilderness without anyone ever knowing what happened to them? The youngest children, 6-year-old Mary and 2-year-old Tommy, were too traumatized to speak coherently about what they had witnessed. Mary alternated between clinging desperately to Rebecca and hiding under the kitchen table whenever she heard unexpected sounds. Little Tommy, who should have been running around and exploring like any healthy toddler, sat motionless in whatever chair he was placed in, his eyes vacant and staring. Dr. Hensley pulled Thomas aside as he finished his examinations. "The physical injuries will heal given time and proper care," the doctor said quietly. "But the psychological damage, children who have experienced trauma this severe often never fully recover. They'll need patience, understanding, and probably years of careful nurturing to even approach normal development." Thomas nodded solemnly, already understanding that his life had changed forever the moment he heard those first cries from underground. These children had no other family, no place to go, and no one else to protect them. The thought of turning them over to territorial authorities, who might include the very people responsible for their parents' deaths, was unthinkable. "They'll stay here," Thomas said simply. "For as long as they need to." Dr. Hensley raised an eyebrow. "Thomas, that's a generous sentiment, but caring for 7 children is an enormous responsibility. You've been struggling yourself since Sarah's passing." "And these children saved my life," Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even himself. "If I hadn't heard them calling for help, I would have—" He glanced toward the window facing the oak tree behind the barn, unable to finish the sentence. "God put them in my path for a reason, Doc. I won't abandon them now." As the evening wore on, Thomas began to understand the practical challenges he was facing. 7 children required food, clothing, sleeping arrangements, and medical care that would strain his resources. More importantly, they would need education, guidance, and the kind of emotional support that he wasn't sure he was capable of providing. Sarah had been the heart of their family, the one who knew how to comfort frightened children and create the atmosphere of love and security that helped young people thrive. But as he watched, Rebecca gently coaxing little Tommy to drink some warm milk, and saw the way Michael instinctively positioned himself to protect the younger twins, Thomas realized these children had already learned to take care of each other. They weren't looking for him to replace their parents. They needed someone to provide safety and stability while they healed from their trauma. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the closest neighbor at 12 miles distance, arrived the next morning with a wagon full of supplies after hearing about the rescue from Jake Morrison. Eleanor was a widow herself, a strong-willed woman in her 40s, who had raised 5 children of her own on a homestead that rivaled the Mackenzie Ranch in size and prosperity. She took one look at the situation and immediately began organizing the household with military efficiency. "Thomas Mackenzie, what were you planning to do with 7 children in a house that hasn't seen a woman's touch in months?" Eleanor demanded, rolling up her sleeves and surveying the chaos in the kitchen. "These little ones need proper care, and you need help whether you're too proud to admit it or not." Eleanor's arrival was a godsend that Thomas hadn't dared to hope for. She brought not only practical supplies, clothing, food, medicines, and toys, but also the feminine perspective that was desperately needed to help the children feel secure. Within hours, she had transformed the atmosphere of the house from a grim masculine refuge into something that resembled a real home again. "The twins can share the small bedroom at the top of the stairs," Eleanor announced, directing Pete and Jake as they moved furniture and made space for the children. "Rebecca and Mary will take Sarah's old sewing room. It gets the best morning light and will help them feel less isolated. The boys can use the spare room behind the kitchen, where it's warm and they can be close if Samuel needs help during the night." But even as the immediate crisis of housing and caring for the children was being addressed, Thomas knew they were facing much larger problems. The men who had murdered the Patterson parents and buried their children alive were still out there, probably continuing their predatory activities against other innocent families. Worse, If they discovered that their victims had survived, they would certainly return to eliminate the witnesses who could identify them. The geographical isolation that had once seemed like paradise now felt like a strategic weakness. The Mackenzie Ranch was far from any major settlements, connected to the outside world only by dirt roads that could be easily watched or blocked. If the false marshals decided to return, Thomas and his small group would have little warning and fewer options for escape or calling for help. That evening, as the children finally settled into sleep in their new beds, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and tried to plan for what came next. The immediate rescue was complete, but he was now responsible for 7 young lives and facing enemies who had already proven their willingness to commit murder to protect their criminal enterprise. Outside, the Montana wind howled around the farmhouse, carrying the promise of winter storms that would soon isolate them even further from potential help. But inside, the house was warm and filled with the quiet sounds of children sleeping safely for the first time in weeks. Thomas Mackenzie had found his purpose in their rescue, but the real test of his commitment was just beginning. The fight to protect these children would demand everything he had to give and possibly more than he knew how to provide. 3 days after the rescue, Samuel Patterson finally opened his eyes and spoke his first coherent words since being pulled from the makeshift grave. Thomas was sitting beside the boy's bed in the converted sewing room, reading aloud from one of Sarah's old books, when Samuel suddenly gripped his arm with surprising strength. "The scar," Samuel whispered, his young voice urgent despite his weakness. "The leader. He had a scar shaped like lightning running from his left eye to his mouth, and he wore a gold tooth right in front. He said his name was Marshall Crawford, but Tommy saw him take the badge off another dead man." Thomas felt his blood run cold. Samuel's fevered ramblings over the past few days had seemed like delirium, but now the boy was speaking with clear, terrifying precision. The details he provided weren't the confused memories of a traumatized child. They were the careful observations of a witness who had seen evil up close and lived to tell about it. "How do you know about the badge?" Thomas asked gently, not wanting to push the boy too hard, but needing to understand what they were facing. Samuel's eyes grew distant as he forced himself to remember. "Before they put us in the box, I heard them talking. The man with the scar was arguing with another one about whether to keep us alive. He said they needed to be far away before anyone found us, but that keeping us around was too risky. That's when the other man said they should just take our parents' badges and use them at the next wagon train they found." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. These weren't just criminals masquerading as federal marshals. They were systematically murdering real law enforcement officers and stealing their credentials to use in future attacks. The scope of their operation was far larger than he had imagined, and if they had been operating this way for months or years, there could be dozens of dead families scattered across the territories. Eleanor Whitman entered the room carrying a bowl of warm broth, her maternal instincts immediately alerting her to the tension in the air. She had been staying at the ranch since the rescue, sleeping in the front parlor and devoting herself to helping the children recover from their ordeal. Her presence had been transformative. The house now felt like a home again, rather than a monument to grief. "Samuel needs rest, Thomas," Eleanor said firmly, setting the bowl on the bedside table. "Whatever he's telling you can wait until he's stronger." But Samuel struggled to sit up, his young face earnest with the need to be heard. "No, ma'am. They're coming back." The man with the scar said they always come back to check on their work, to make sure there weren't any witnesses left behind. He said it was the most important rule of their business. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged alarmed glances. If Samuel's right, the false marshals would eventually return to ensure the children were dead and properly buried. When they discovered the empty grave and signs of rescue, they would know their victims had survived to identify them. The remote location that had initially protected the children would then become a trap, as the criminals would know exactly where to find them. How long? Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. How long did they say before they'd come back? Samuel closed his eyes, concentrating on memories that were clearly painful to relive. The man with the scar said they'd give it 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the weather was bad. Said that would be long enough for us to die slow and for any search parties to give up looking. Thomas quickly calculated the timeline in his head. The attack on the wagon train had occurred 3 weeks ago, which meant the criminals might return at any time to verify their victims were dead. If they arrived during daylight hours, they would see the signs of recent digging and know immediately that the children had been rescued. From that point, tracking the survivors to the ranch house would be a simple matter of following footprints and wheel ruts in the soft earth. That evening, after the children had been put to bed, Thomas convened a war council in the kitchen with Eleanor, Jake, and Pete. The 4 adults sat around the worn wooden table where Thomas had once planned his suicide, now plotting instead how to protect 7 innocent lives from determined killers. "We need to get word to the territorial authorities," Eleanor insisted, her usual calm demeanor showing cracks of fear for the children she had already come to love. "Surely there are honest lawmen who can help us." Jake Morrison shook his grizzled head. "Problem is, we don't know who we can trust. If these killers have been stealing badges and credentials, they might have contacts in legitimate law enforcement. Send word to the wrong person, and we'll be leading the wolves right to the children." Pete Sullivan, who had been quietly whittling a piece of wood while listening to the discussion, looked up with thoughtful eyes. "There's another problem nobody's mentioned yet. Even if we find honest law, what happens to the children while we're waiting for help? They can't stay here. It's too isolated, too easy to surround. But they can't travel far in their condition either, especially with winter coming on." Thomas stared into his coffee cup, weighing options that all seemed to lead to disaster. The children were finally beginning to heal from their trauma, developing the first tentative trust in adults since watching their parents murdered. Moving them now would undo much of that progress and possibly put them in even greater danger. "There might be another way," Thomas said slowly, an idea forming in his mind that was both desperate and dangerous. "What if we don't run from them? What if we make them come to us, but on our terms?" Eleanor's eyes widened with alarm. "Thomas, you can't be thinking of using the children as bait. It's too dangerous, and they've suffered enough." "Not as bait," Thomas clarified quickly, "as the reason we have to win. These men are coming whether we run or stay. But if we stay, we can choose the battlefield and prepare for them. If we run, we might walk straight into another trap or lead them to other innocent families." Jake leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. "What did you have in mind, boss?" Thomas stood and walked to the window facing the eastern pasture, where the empty grave served as a grim reminder of how close they had come to tragedy. "We know they're coming, but they don't know we know. We have maybe a week to prepare, possibly less. We use that time to turn this ranch into a fortress and gather every honest man within 50 miles to help us make a stand." The plan that emerged over the next hour was audacious in its simplicity. Thomas would send Jake to visit every ranch and homestead in the region, spreading word about the children's rescue and the threat posed by the false marshals. Any man with a backbone and a rifle would be invited to help defend the Mackenzie Ranch against the expected attack. Meanwhile, Pete would ride to Cedar Falls and Billings, seeking out law enforcement officers whose honesty was beyond question. Dr. Hensley had contacts in the territorial government who might be able to verify which federal marshals were legitimate and which badges had been reported stolen. Eleanor would remain at the ranch with the children, maintaining the appearance of normal life while secretly preparing for siege conditions. The house would be stocked with food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies. The children would be taught emergency procedures and shown hiding places where they could take shelter if the situation became desperate. "It's a good plan," Jake admitted, but it depends on a lot of things going right. What if we can't find enough honest men to help? What if the killers arrive before we're ready? What if they're smarter than we think and approach from an unexpected direction? Thomas returned to his seat at the table, his face grim but determined. Then we improvise and fight with whatever we have. But I won't run from these murderers and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when they'll catch up to us. And I won't abandon other families to suffer what the Pattersons suffered. As the meeting broke up and the adults prepared for what might be their last peaceful night for some time, Thomas found himself thinking about Sarah and how she would have handled this crisis. His wife had possessed an inner strength that complemented his own stubbornness, a wisdom that helped him see beyond his immediate anger to consider consequences and alternatives. Sarah would have been terrified for the children's safety, but she would have agreed that running wasn't the answer. She had always believed that evil flourished when good people chose comfort over confrontation, and she would have insisted on fighting to protect not just their own family, but all the families these criminals might target in the future. The next morning brought the first test of their resolve when Rebecca Patterson approached Thomas with a request that caught him completely off guard. The 14-year-old girl had been helping Eleanor with household tasks, throwing herself into work as a way of coping with her trauma. But now she stood before Thomas with the same determination that had kept her siblings alive during their underground ordeal. "Mr. Mackenzie," Rebecca said, her young voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was asking, "I want to learn how to shoot. If the bad men come back, I want to be able to protect my brothers and sisters." Thomas looked into Rebecca's eyes and saw something that reminded him of Sarah, an inner fire that no amount of suffering could extinguish. This child had already proven her courage under the most horrific circumstances imaginable. Denying her request would be both insulting and foolish. "All right," Thomas said simply. "But you'll learn the right way, with proper safety and respect for what guns can do. And you'll only use that knowledge if there's no other choice." As Rebecca nodded solemnly, Thomas realized that the children weren't just victims to be protected. They were survivors who deserved the right to defend themselves and each other. The false marshals had created their own worst enemies by allowing these children to live. Now those children would have the chance to ensure their parents' murderers faced justice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Thomas Mackenzie believed about courage, justice, and the price of protecting innocence. The men who had buried 7 children alive were about to discover that their victims had not only survived, but found a protector willing to risk everything to ensure they never harmed another family. Winter was coming to Montana. But first would come a reckoning written in lead and gunpowder. Jake Morrison rode out at dawn with a mission that would determine whether they stood alone against the false marshals or had an army of honest men beside them. His saddlebags carried letters written in Thomas's careful handwriting, each one explaining the situation and requesting aid from ranchers, homesteaders, and townsmen throughout the region. The success of their defense would depend entirely on how many good men were willing to risk their lives to protect 7 orphan children. The first stop was the Peterson Ranch, 12 miles east through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous. As winter approached, Carl Peterson was a Norwegian immigrant who had built his homestead through sheer determination and backbreaking labor, clearing rocks and battling harsh weather to create a prosperous cattle operation. His wife Anna had died 2 years earlier in childbirth, leaving him to raise their young son Eric alone. Jake found Peterson mending fence in the bitter morning cold, his thick hands working efficiently despite the temperature that made metal tools painful to touch. When Jake explained the situation and handed over Thomas's letter, Peterson read it twice before looking up with eyes that blazed with righteous anger. 7 children, Peterson said in his heavily accented English, his voice tight with emotion. Buried alive by men who pretend to be lawmen. This is the kind of evil my family came to America to escape. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his coat. "Eric and I will come. We bring rifles and ammunition, and we stay until this is finished." The response was the same at every homestead Jake visited throughout that long day. The frontier had created a brotherhood among honest men who understood that survival often depended on neighbors helping neighbors. The story of the Patterson children resonated deeply with families who had their own young ones to protect, and the systematic nature of the false marshals' crimes threatened everyone who traveled the remote roads between settlements by evening. Jake had visited 14 ranches and homesteads, and every single family had pledged support. Some could only spare one man and a rifle, while others promised to bring entire crews of hired hands. The widow Martha Donovan, who ran a successful horse ranch with the help of her 3 grown sons, declared that her boys would ride to the Mackenzie place immediately and stay as long as needed. Meanwhile, Pete Sullivan faced a more delicate mission in the towns of Cedar Falls and Billings. Identifying trustworthy law enforcement officials required careful investigation and diplomatic inquiry, as any wrong move could alert corrupt officers to their location and plans. Pete started with Sheriff Marcus Webb in Cedar Falls, a man whose integrity was legendary throughout the county. Sheriff Webb listened to Pete's story with the grave attention of someone who had seen too much violence in his 30 years of law enforcement. When Pete finished explaining about the false marshals and their systematic murder of wagon trains, Webb leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. "I've been hearing rumors about this for months," Webb admitted, his weathered face creased with worry. Reports of wagon trains that simply vanished, families that never reached their destinations, federal marshals operating in areas where none should have been assigned. But every time I tried to investigate, I hit walls of bureaucratic confusion and missing paperwork. Webb opened his desk drawer and withdrew a thick file folder. 3 weeks ago, I received word that Marshal James Crawford had been found dead near the Yellowstone River, shot in the back and stripped of his badge and identification. The description matches what your boy Samuel provided: lightning-shaped scar, gold front tooth, about 40 years old. Pete felt ice water flow through his veins. "You mean the real Marshal Crawford is dead?" "Has been for over a month," Webb confirmed grimly. "Which means the man leading these attacks has been using a dead officer's credentials to commit wholesale murder. This isn't just robbery or random violence, it's organized terrorism, designed to make the territories unsafe for honest settlers." Sheriff Webb immediately began organizing a response that went far beyond what Pete had hoped for. Telegraph messages were sent to law enforcement agencies across 3 territories, alerting them to the false marshal operation and requesting assistance. A special deputy force was assembled from trusted men in both Cedar Falls and Billings, all of whom volunteered to ride to the Mackenzie Ranch and help defend the children. But the most significant development came when Webb contacted his friend, Captain Robert Hayes of the U.S. Army garrison at Fort Ellis. Captain Hayes had been investigating reports of missing military supply convoys and suspected that the same criminal organization might be responsible for both the wagon train attacks and the theft of government property. "Captain Hayes is mobilizing a full cavalry troop," Webb told Pete as they prepared to ride toward the Mackenzie Ranch. 40 trained soldiers with military equipment and experience fighting organized criminal gangs. They should reach your ranch within 2 days, assuming the weather holds. Back at the ranch, Thomas was conducting his own preparations with methodical precision born from years of military service during the Indian Wars. The farmhouse was being transformed into a defensive position, with furniture moved to create firing positions and supplies stockpiled in rooms that offered the best protection from incoming gunfire. Eleanor Whitman had proven invaluable in organizing the domestic aspects of their preparation. She coordinated with neighboring ranch wives to ensure adequate food and medical supplies, while also maintaining a calm atmosphere that helped prevent the children from becoming too frightened by the obvious military preparations around them. The key is keeping them busy and focused on normal activities, Eleanor explained to Thomas as they watched. Rebecca teaching the younger children a card game in the kitchen. They've already seen too much violence and terror. If we can maintain some sense of normalcy while we prepare for the worst, they'll be better able to cope with whatever comes next. The children themselves showed remarkable resilience and adaptability. Michael Patterson, the 12-year-old boy, appointed himself as a junior guard and spent hours watching the roads from the upstairs windows. The twins David and Daniel turned their surveillance duties into a game, competing to see who could spot riders approaching from the greatest distance. Even little Mary, the 6-year-old who had been nearly catatonic after the rescue, began showing signs of recovery as she helped Eleanor with cooking and cleaning. Having specific tasks and responsibilities seemed to give the children a sense of control over their environment that had been completely absent during their captivity. Samuel's recovery continued to improve daily, and his detailed memory of the false marshal's operation proved invaluable for planning their defense. He drew detailed sketches of the men who had murdered his parents, providing descriptions that would help identify them when they inevitably returned to check on their victims. The man with the scar always carried 2 pistols, Samuel told Thomas as he worked on his drawings. And he had this way of talking that made it sound like he was reciting from a book he'd memorized. Like he'd given the same speeches about federal authority and legal warrants so many times that they didn't mean anything to him anymore. The most disturbing detail that emerged from Samuel's memories was the organized nature of the criminal operation. The false marshals weren't just a gang of opportunistic robbers. They were part of a larger network that included suppliers, fences for stolen goods, and contacts within legitimate government agencies who provided information about valuable targets. They knew exactly what our wagon train was carrying, Samuel explained, his young face serious beyond his years. They knew Papa had sold his farm and was carrying the money to buy land in Oregon. They knew about the other family's savings and valuables. Someone had told them exactly what they would find when they attacked us. This revelation added another layer of urgency to their situation. If the criminal network included informants within banks, land offices, or government agencies, then their preparations might already be known to their enemies. The false marshals might arrive with more men and better information than Thomas had planned for. On the 3rd day after Jake's departure, the first of their reinforcements began arriving. Carl Peterson and his son Eric rode in just after sunrise, their rifles cleaned and ready, their faces grim with determination. Throughout the day, more men arrived, solitary homesteaders, groups of ranch hands, and even a few veterans of the Indian Wars who understood the importance of standing together against organized evil. By evening, Thomas counted 26 men gathered in his barn, each one prepared to risk his life to protect 7 orphaned children from the criminals who had murdered their parents. The sight of so many neighbors willing to fight for justice filled Thomas with a hope he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. Sheriff Webb arrived just before sunset with 12 deputized men and news that the cavalry troop from Fort Ellis would reach them by the following afternoon. For the first time since Samuel had revealed the timeline of their enemy's return, Thomas began to believe they might actually have enough firepower to defeat the false marshals. But even as their defensive preparations neared completion, troubling news arrived with the last group of volunteers. A rancher named Bill Hawkins brought word that strange riders had been seen watching several homesteads from a distance, men who disappeared whenever anyone approached them for conversation. "They're scouting us," Thomas realized with growing alarm. "They're already here, watching and planning their attack." The realization that their enemies might be closer than expected sent a chill through the assembled defenders. The false marshals weren't just returning to check on their buried victims. They were conducting military-style reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about the ranch's defenses and the number of men who had come to protect the children as night fell over the Mackenzie ranch. Sentries took their positions, and weapons were checked one final time. The confrontation they had been preparing for was no longer a future possibility. It was an immediate threat that could materialize with the rising sun. The children were moved to the most secure room in the house, a root cellar that had been expanded and reinforced to serve as a shelter during attacks. Rebecca Patterson insisted on staying with the defenders, her rifle loaded and her determination absolute. "They killed my parents," she said simply when Thomas suggested she should stay with the younger children. "I have the right to help make them pay for what they've done." Thomas looked into Rebecca's eyes and saw the same fierce protectiveness that had kept her siblings alive in their underground prison. Some battles required everyone to fight, regardless of age, and this was clearly one of them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of 7 orphan children, but the future safety of every honest family trying to build a life in the Montana Territory. The false marshals had created their own nemesis by allowing these children to survive, and now they would face the consequences of their cruelty. The attack came at dawn on the 4th day, just as Thomas had feared it would. The false marshals struck when the defenders' vigilance was at its lowest ebb. In those precious minutes when night sentries were being relieved and morning patrols were just beginning their rounds. It was a tactical decision that spoke to their military experience and confirmed Samuel's descriptions of their calculated cruelty. Michael Patterson spotted them first from his watchpost in the hayloft, his young eyes catching the glint of morning sunlight on metal as 7 horsemen emerged from the tree line at the eastern edge of the property. The boy's warning shout echoed across the ranch yard, instantly transforming the peaceful morning into a scene of controlled chaos as defenders rushed to their assigned positions. 7 riders coming in fast from the east. Michael called down to the men below. The man in front matches Samuel's description, big scar on his face and riding a black stallion. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he grabbed his rifle and took position behind the reinforced water trough that had been converted into a makeshift barricade. After days of preparation and waiting, the moment of truth had finally arrived. Everything they had planned and prepared for would be tested in the next few minutes. The man calling himself Marshal Crawford rode with the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating honest citizens through the authority of his stolen badge. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the lightning-shaped scar that ran from the killer's left eye to the corner of his mouth, a disfigurement that gave his face a perpetually sinister expression. But what struck Thomas most was how ordinary the false marshals looked as they approached the ranch. They weren't the grotesque monsters that his imagination had conjured during sleepless nights of planning. They were simply evil men who had learned to hide their true nature behind badges and official-sounding speeches. Thomas Mackenzie, Crawford's voice carried clearly across the morning air, amplified by the practiced projection of someone accustomed to addressing crowds. "This is United States Marshal James Crawford. We're here on federal business regarding the investigation of a missing wagon train." The audacity of the man was breathtaking. Even knowing that witnesses to his crimes were hidden inside the ranch house, Crawford continued to maintain his charade of legitimate authority. It spoke to how successful this deception had been in the past. Honest citizens were trained to respect and cooperate with federal officials, making them easy targets for well-organized criminals. Thomas stepped out from behind his barricade, his rifle held ready but not directly threatening. The time for hiding was over, and these murderers needed to understand that their victims had survived and found protectors willing to fight. "The children you buried alive are safe inside this house," Thomas called back, his voice carrying clearly in the cold morning air. "They've told us everything about what you did to their parents and how you've been murdering wagon trains across 3 territories. Your reign of terror ends here." For a moment, Crawford's confident mask slipped, revealing surprise and then rage as he realized his carefully planned operation had been compromised. But the expression passed quickly, replaced by the cold calculation of a professional killer, adapting to unexpected circumstances. "I don't know what lies these children have been telling you," Crawford replied, his tone shifting to sound reasonable and official. "But they are material witnesses in a federal investigation. Interfering with federal law enforcement is a serious crime that could result in charges of obstruction and harboring fugitives." Even now, faced with armed resistance and exposed as a fraud, Crawford was attempting to use the authority of his stolen badge to intimidate his opponents. The man's psychological manipulation was as dangerous as his guns, designed to create doubt and hesitation in people who had been raised to respect legitimate law enforcement. Sheriff Webb stepped into view from behind the barn, his own badge glinting in the morning sunlight as he leveled his rifle at Crawford's chest. The appearance of genuine law enforcement seemed to shake the false marshal's confidence for the first time since his arrival. "James Crawford has been dead for 6 weeks, Webb announced in a voice that carried absolute authority. "Shot in the back and stripped of his credentials by murdering thieves who have been using his identity to commit wholesale slaughter across the territories. You're under arrest for murder, robbery, and impersonating a federal officer." The confrontation had reached its breaking point. Crawford and his men could no longer maintain their charade of legitimate authority, and their only options were surrender or violence. Given their history of murdering entire families rather than leaving witnesses, their choice was inevitable. Crawford's hand moved toward his gun even as he continued speaking, his voice taking on the dangerous edge of a cornered predator. "You people have no idea what you're interfering with. We represent interests that go far beyond your understanding, and there will be consequences for—" His words were cut off by the sharp crack of rifle fire as one of his men attempted to draw on Sheriff Webb. The shot went wide, striking the barn wall behind the sheriff's position, but it served as the signal that transformed negotiation into warfare. Thomas's first shot took Crawford's horse in the chest, sending the false marshal tumbling to the ground and eliminating his advantage of mobility. Around the ranch yard, muzzle flashes erupted from carefully prepared defensive positions as 24 honest men opened fire on the criminals who had terrorized the territory for months. The false marshals had expected to find a frightened rancher and 7 helpless children. Instead, they faced a coordinated defense by experienced fighters who had spent days preparing for this exact confrontation. The tactical surprise was complete, and the criminals found themselves caught in a crossfire with no cover and nowhere to retreat. But these weren't ordinary bandits. They were professional killers with military training and years of experience in violent confrontations. Even caught by surprise and outnumbered, they fought with the desperate efficiency of men who knew capture meant a hangman's noose. Crawford rolled behind his fallen horse and returned fire with both pistols, his shots surprisingly accurate despite his disadvantageous position. One of his bullets shattered the window behind Thomas's position, sending glass fragments flying through the air like deadly rain. "Rebecca, keep the children down," Thomas shouted toward the house as he reloaded his rifle. The 14-year-old girl had positioned herself at an upstairs window with her own weapon, and Thomas could see her methodically taking aim at the attackers below. The battle raged for nearly 10 minutes, with gunfire echoing across the ranch valley like thunder from a sudden storm. 2 of the false marshals were killed in the initial volley, their bodies sprawling motionless in the ranch yard. A third was wounded but continued fighting from behind a wagon, his blood staining the earth as he grimly returned fire. Carl Peterson took a bullet in the shoulder but continued shooting with grim determination, his Norwegian stubbornness refusing to let a mere gunshot wound remove him from the fight. His son Eric proved himself a capable marksman, his shots forcing one of the criminals to abandon his position and seek cover closer to the ranch house. The tide of battle turned decisively. When the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Captain Hayes and his cavalry troop, 40 trained soldiers appeared on the horizon like an avenging army, their military discipline and superior firepower ending any hope the false marshals might have had of fighting their way to freedom. Crawford, seeing his men falling around him and faced with the prospect of capture by federal troops, made one final desperate attempt to complete his original mission. Breaking from cover, he sprinted toward the ranch house with his remaining pistol drawn, clearly intending to murder the children who could testify against him. Thomas intercepted him halfway across the yard, the two men colliding with bone-jarring force that sent them both tumbling to the ground. Crawford was younger and more experienced in hand-to-hand combat, but Thomas fought with the desperate strength of a man protecting children he had come to love as his own. They rolled across the dirt, each trying to gain control of Crawford's pistol while landing punches and grappling for advantage. Thomas felt the killer's fingers clawing at his face, seeking his eyes, while Crawford's knee drove repeatedly into his ribs with bruising force. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the air as they struggled, its bullet whistling past the ranch house roof. But Crawford managed to draw a hidden knife from his boot, the blade glinting wickedly as he raised it toward Thomas's throat. The sharp crack of a rifle shot froze both men in position. Crawford's eyes widened in shock and pain as Rebecca Patterson's bullet found its mark, striking him in the chest with the precision of someone who had learned to shoot with deadly seriousness. Crawford collapsed backward, his stolen badge falling from his coat to land in the dirt beside him. With his dying breath, he whispered words that chilled Thomas to the bone. "This doesn't end ... with us. There are ... others. They'll keep coming." As Captain Hayes and his soldiers secured the ranch yard and tended to the wounded, Thomas knelt beside Crawford's body and retrieved the false badge that had been the symbol of so much terror and death. The real Marshal Crawford had died trying to protect innocent people, and his stolen identity had been used to murder countless families across the territories. But even in victory, Crawford's final words haunted Thomas. The man had spoken of others, suggesting that this criminal network extended far beyond the 7 men who had attacked the ranch. How many more false marshals were operating across the Western territories? How many other families would suffer if the larger organization wasn't completely destroyed? Rebecca Patterson emerged from the house with her smoking rifle still in her hands, her young face pale but determined. She had fired the shot that ended Crawford's life and saved Thomas from the killer's knife, proving once again that the Patterson children were survivors who would not be victims again. "Is it over?" she asked simply, looking down at the man who had murdered her parents and tried to bury her alive with her siblings. Thomas looked around the ranch yard, where honest men were binding wounds and gathering the weapons of defeated criminals. The immediate threat was ended, but Crawford's dying words suggested that their fight for justice was far from complete. "This part is over," Thomas replied, putting a protective arm around Rebecca's shoulders. "But there's more work to do. We need to make sure this never happens to another family." The battle for the Mackenzie Ranch was won, but the war against the criminal network that had terrorized the territories was just beginning. And Thomas Mackenzie, the man who had once planned to end his life beneath an oak tree, now found himself committed to a larger fight that would demand everything he had learned about courage, justice, and protecting the innocent. The investigation that began in the hours following the battle revealed a criminal enterprise so vast and sophisticated that it shook the foundations of territorial law enforcement. Captain Hayes and his men, working alongside Sheriff Webb and federal investigators who arrived from Denver, methodically cataloged evidence that painted a picture of corruption extending into the highest levels of government. Crawford's saddlebags contained detailed records of their operations spanning 18 months and covering 4 territories. The meticulous documentation suggested a criminal mind that operated more like a business executive than a common outlaw. Each wagon train attack was recorded with clinical precision. Dates, locations, estimated value of stolen goods, and the disposition of witnesses, a euphemism that made Thomas's blood run cold as he realized how many families had simply vanished without a trace. "Look at this," Captain Hayes said grimly, spreading the documents across Thomas's kitchen table while the children played quietly in the next room, still processing their trauma through this simple act of normal childhood activities. They weren't just robbing travelers, they were targeting specific families based on intelligence gathered from banks, land offices, and immigration services. The scope of the conspiracy became clear as investigators pieced together the evidence. The criminal network included corrupt clerks in territorial offices who provided information about families carrying large sums of money or valuable goods. Bank employees leaked details about customers who had sold property or businesses and were traveling with the proceeds. Even some legitimate law enforcement officers had been compromised, either through bribery or intimidation. Samuel Patterson, still pale from his injuries but determined to help bring his parents' killers to justice, provided crucial testimony about conversations he had overheard during his captivity. The boy's remarkable memory for detail had preserved information that became vital evidence in unraveling the larger conspiracy. The man with the scar talked about someone called the Senator. Samuel told the investigators, his young voice steady despite the painful memories he was reliving. He said the Senator had contacts in Washington who could make problems disappear and provide advance warning if federal investigators got too close to their operations. The reference to a senator sent shockwaves through the investigating team. If the criminal network included a sitting United States senator, then the corruption reached the very heart of the federal government. Such protection would explain how the false marshals had operated with impunity for so long, always staying one step ahead of legitimate law enforcement efforts. Federal Marshal William Donovan, who had arrived from Denver with a team of investigators, took personal charge of following up on Samuel's testimony. Donovan was a man in his 40s with the bearing of someone who had spent years fighting corruption and organized crime. His presence brought both expertise and authority that the local investigation desperately needed. "We've been tracking similar operations in Colorado and Wyoming," Donovan explained to Thomas and the other defenders as they gathered in the ranch house parlor. "Always the same pattern: federal marshals with proper credentials who target wagon trains and isolated homesteads. But every time we get close to identifying the leaders, key witnesses disappear or evidence gets mysteriously lost." The investigation took on new urgency when a coded telegram was discovered among Crawford's possessions. The message, dated just 2 days before the attack on the ranch, contained what appeared to be instructions from a superior authority. When federal cryptographers finally decoded the message, its contents revealed the true scope of the threat they were facing. "Proceed with witness elimination as planned," the decoded message read. "Senator confirms federal investigation. Suspended pending review. Expand operations to Colorado territory immediately. New targets identified through Denver land office contacts." The telegram proved that the criminal network was not only active, but expanding, with new attacks planned based on intelligence gathered through corrupted government agencies. More chilling still was the confirmation that a United States senator was actively protecting the operation and using his influence to hinder federal investigations. Eleanor Whitman, who had remained at the ranch to help care for the children during the investigation, proved invaluable in organizing the domestic aspects of what had become a complex law enforcement operation. The ranch house had been transformed into an unofficial headquarters, with federal investigators, military personnel, and local law enforcement officers working around the clock to build cases against the surviving members of the criminal network. The children need stability while all this is happening, Eleanor told Thomas as they watched Rebecca helping her younger siblings with their evening meal. "They've been through enough trauma without having to live in the middle of a military investigation." Perhaps we should consider sending them somewhere safe until this is resolved. But Thomas found himself reluctant to separate the children from the ranch that had become their sanctuary. In the weeks since their rescue, they had begun to heal from their ordeal, forming attachments to him, Eleanor, and the other people who had risked their lives to protect them. Moving them again, even for their own safety, might undo the progress they had made in learning to trust adults again. More importantly, the children themselves insisted on remaining involved in the investigation. Rebecca Patterson, in particular, demonstrated a mature understanding of the larger implications of their case. At 14, she had become the unofficial leader of her siblings and took her responsibility for their welfare with deadly seriousness. We're the only witnesses who can identify all of the men who killed our parents, Rebecca told Thomas when he suggested they might be safer elsewhere. If we run away and hide, these criminals will just find other families to hurt. We have a duty to see this through to the end. The wisdom and courage of Rebecca's words reminded Thomas of Sarah and the strength she had shown during their own difficult times. These children had been forged by tragedy into something stronger than their years should have produced, and they deserved the respect that came with such hard-won maturity. The investigation's scope expanded dramatically when federal agents discovered Crawford's connection to a criminal organization that operated across multiple territories under the protection of corrupt officials. The network included not only false marshals, but also fake cattle inspectors, bogus tax collectors, and counterfeit territorial judges who could legitimize the seizure of property and the arrest of inconvenient witnesses. It's the most sophisticated criminal enterprise we've ever encountered, Marshal Donovan admitted to Thomas as they reviewed the growing mountain of evidence. They've essentially created a shadow government that can operate with impunity because they control key positions in the legitimate government structure. The breakthrough in identifying the senator came from an unexpected source. Little Mary Patterson, the 6-year-old who had been largely silent since her rescue, suddenly spoke up during one of the investigation sessions when she overheard investigators discussing their search for the criminal network's political protector. "I heard that name before," Mary said quietly, her small voice cutting through the adult conversation like a knife. "When the bad men were talking at night, they said Senator Morrison was getting impatient and wanted them to finish their work and move to the Colorado Territory." The room fell silent as the implications of Mary's words sank in. Senator Harrison Morrison was one of Montana Territory's most powerful political figures, a man whose influence extended far beyond his official position. If Morrison was indeed the senator protecting the criminal network, then the corruption reached the highest levels of territorial government. Marshal Donovan immediately dispatched telegrams to federal authorities in Washington, requesting investigation into Senator Morrison's activities and financial records. But everyone involved understood that building a case against such a powerful figure would require ironclad evidence and careful coordination with authorities who were beyond Morrison's sphere of influence. The children's role in the investigation became even more crucial as federal agents worked to build cases against the surviving members of the criminal network. Several of Crawford's men had been captured alive during the ranch battle, and their testimony would be vital in identifying other members of the organization and their government protectors. But the prisoners proved reluctant to cooperate, apparently more afraid of their own organization than they were of federal justice. 2 attempted suicides in the first week of their captivity, and the 3rd prisoner insisted that his own family would be murdered if he provided testimony against his superiors. "They're terrified of someone," Captain Hayes observed as he discussed the prisoners' behavior with Thomas and Marshal Donovan. "These are hardened criminals who have committed multiple murders, but something about their own organization scares them more than the prospect of hanging." The answer to the prisoners' fear became clear when federal investigators in Denver uncovered evidence of the network's enforcement methods. Families of uncooperative members didn't just disappear, they were systematically tortured and killed, in ways designed to serve as examples to others who might consider betraying the organization. Among Crawford's papers, investigators found photographs and detailed descriptions of the fates that had befallen the families of members who had attempted to leave the organization or cooperate with law enforcement. The calculated cruelty was designed not just to eliminate threats, but to create terror that would ensure absolute loyalty from surviving members. Thomas found himself sickened by the evidence of systematic evil that emerged from the investigation. These weren't just criminals motivated by greed, they were monsters who had created an organization that operated through terror and corruption on a scale that threatened the very foundations of civilized society. But even as the scope of the criminal network became clear, Thomas also saw signs of hope in the response from honest law enforcement officers and ordinary citizens. The willingness of his neighbors to risk their lives protecting the Patterson children had demonstrated that evil, no matter how well organized or protected, could not ultimately triumph over the courage of good people working together. The investigation was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for bringing down a criminal empire that had operated with impunity for too long. The 7 children who had been buried alive had survived to become the key witnesses in a case that would reshape law enforcement across the Western Territories. And Thomas Mackenzie, the grieving widower who had once stood beneath an oak tree with a rope in his hands, now found himself at the center of a fight for justice that would define his legacy for generations to come. The children had saved his life by giving him a purpose worth living for, and now he would help them save countless other families from the evil that had destroyed their own. The confrontation with Senator Harrison Morrison began not with gunfire or dramatic arrests, but with the methodical gathering of evidence that would prove his involvement in the criminal network. Federal investigators worked with painstaking care to build an ironclad case, knowing that a man of Morrison's political influence would have resources and connections that could make evidence disappear or witnesses vanish if they moved too quickly. Marshall Donovan established a secure communications network between the Mackenzie Ranch and federal headquarters in Denver, using military couriers rather than telegraph lines that might be monitored by Morrison's allies. Every piece of evidence was documented in triplicate, with copies stored in different locations to prevent the systematic destruction that had derailed previous investigations. The breakthrough came when federal agents in Washington discovered financial records showing massive payments from unknown sources into accounts controlled by Senator Morrison. The timing of these deposits corresponded perfectly with major criminal operations identified in Crawford's records, creating a pattern that was too precise to be coincidental. "Look at this," Marshall Donovan said, spreading bank documents across the kitchen table where the Patterson children now did their daily lessons under Eleanor's guidance. Every time Crawford's organization pulled off a major robbery, Morrison received a payment of exactly 10% of the estimated value within 2 weeks. It's like he was collecting a commission on their crimes. Thomas studied the financial records with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read contracts and legal documents during his years as a successful rancher. The pattern was undeniable. Morrison wasn't just protecting the criminal network. He was profiting directly from their activities and using his political position to enable their operations. But building a financial case against Morrison was only part of the challenge. The senator had spent years cultivating relationships with powerful allies who would resist any attempt to bring him to justice. Federal investigators warned that Morrison's network of political protection extended into the Department of Justice itself, meaning that some officials in Washington might actively work to sabotage the investigation. The solution came from an unexpected source. Captain Hayes, whose military background gave him contacts in the War Department that operated independently of civilian law enforcement, proposed involving the Army in what he termed a military investigation of threats to territorial security. Since the criminal network had been attacking civilian settlements and interfering with federal mail routes, Military jurisdiction could be established without alerting Morrison's allies in civilian law enforcement. The beauty of this approach, Captain Hayes explained to the assembled investigators, is that military investigations operate under different legal authorities than civilian ones. Morrison's political influence won't protect him from a court-martial tribunal if we can prove he's been conspiring with enemies of the United States. The military investigation required relocating the Patterson children to a secure location, where they could provide testimony without fear of retaliation. Fort Ellis, with its military guards and controlled access, offered the kind of protection that the remote ranch could no longer provide once Morrison learned that his criminal network had been exposed. Rebecca Patterson, now 15 and increasingly mature beyond her years, understood the necessity of the move but struggled with leaving the ranch that had become their sanctuary. The Mackenzie place represented safety and family in a way that the sterile military environment of the fort could never match. "I know we have to go," Rebecca told Thomas as they prepared for the transfer, "but this feels like we're running away again, just like we did when the bad men first caught us. I'm tired of being afraid and having other people make decisions about our lives." Thomas knelt beside Rebecca, seeing in her green eyes the same determination that had kept her siblings alive during their underground ordeal. "This isn't running away," he said gently. "This is moving to a position where you can fight back safely. There's a difference between strategic retreat and cowardice, and what you're doing takes more courage than staying here and hoping for the best." The move to Fort Ellis proved beneficial in unexpected ways. The military environment provided structure and security that helped the younger children continue their recovery from trauma. Military doctors and chaplains had experience treating soldiers who had witnessed horrific violence, and their techniques proved effective in helping the Patterson children process their experiences. More importantly, the military investigation uncovered evidence that civilian authorities had missed or deliberately ignored. Army intelligence officers, working with trusted federal agents, discovered that Morrison's criminal network had been systematically targeting military supply convoys and stealing weapons that were then sold to hostile Indian tribes. "This changes everything," Captain Hayes announced after receiving reports from Army investigators. "Morrison isn't just a corrupt politician. He's actively supporting enemies of the United States by providing them with military weapons. That makes him a traitor, and treason is a capital offense that even his political connections can't protect him from." The evidence of Morrison's involvement in arming hostile tribes created a new urgency in the investigation. Recent attacks on military posts and civilian settlements had been unusually well coordinated and equipped, suggesting that the stolen weapons were being used effectively against American forces and frontier communities. Samuel Patterson, whose head injury had healed but left him with occasional severe headaches, provided crucial testimony about weapons he had seen in Crawford's possession. The boy's detailed memory helped military investigators identify specific types of rifles and ammunition that had been reported stolen from Army convoys. "I saw boxes marked with Army stamps," Samuel told the military tribunal that had been convened to hear testimony. "The man with the scar was real proud of them, said they were better than anything the Indians had ever seen before." He laughed about how the Army was paying him to kill soldiers with their own guns. The military tribunal, composed of senior officers who had fought in the Indian Wars and understood the deadly implications of supplying modern weapons to hostile tribes, moved with efficiency that civilian courts could never match. Arrest warrants were issued under military authority, and Army units were dispatched to apprehend Morrison and his remaining co-conspirators. But Morrison had not survived decades in territorial politics without developing an instinct for self-preservation. Word of the military investigation reached him through sources that investigators had not yet identified, giving him time to attempt one final desperate gambit to eliminate the witnesses who could destroy him. The attack on Fort Ellis came at Midnight on a moonless night in early December, when snow and freezing temperatures created conditions that favored attackers who knew the terrain. Morrison had assembled a force of hired gunmen, corrupt lawmen, and surviving members of Crawford's organization for what he clearly intended to be a final solution to his witness problem. The assault began with diversionary attacks on the fort's outer perimeters, designed to draw defenders away from the secured barracks where the Patterson children were being housed. Explosions rocked the ammunition depot and stables, creating chaos and confusion that would have succeeded against a less prepared defense. But Captain Hayes had anticipated such an attempt and prepared accordingly. The fort's defenses had been quietly reinforced with additional troops and artillery, while the children had been moved to a heavily fortified bunker that could withstand direct assault. The attackers found themselves facing not the confused and scattered defense they had expected, but a coordinated military response that turned their own tactics against them. Thomas Mackenzie, who had insisted on remaining with the children despite offers of separate protection, found himself once again fighting for the lives of the young people who had become his family. Armed with a military rifle and positioned in a defensive position that commanded the approaches to the children's bunker, he waited for the inevitable assault. The attack came in waves, with Morrison's hired gunmen attempting to overwhelm the fort's defenses through sheer numbers and coordinated assaults. But these were not the disciplined soldiers that military tactics assumed. They were criminals and corrupt officials who had never faced determined resistance from trained troops with superior positions and equipment. Eleanor Whitman, who had accompanied the children to Fort Ellis to provide maternal care during their testimony, proved her frontier toughness by taking up arms alongside the soldiers. Her sharpshooting skills, developed during years of protecting her own homestead from predators both animal and human, made her a valuable addition to the fort's defense. "These children have suffered enough," Eleanor declared as she methodically picked off attackers who tried to approach the bunker. "Any man who wants to hurt them will have to go through me first, and I promise that won't be easy." The tide of battle turned decisively when reinforcements arrived from the territorial capital, bringing federal marshals and additional army units that had been standing by for this exact scenario. Morrison's force, caught between the fort's defenders and the approaching reinforcements, began to disintegrate as individual attackers realized their situation was hopeless. Morrison himself was captured alive while attempting to escape on horseback across the frozen prairie. The man who had seemed so powerful and untouchable in the political halls of Helena was reduced to a desperate fugitive stumbling through snowdrifts in a futile attempt to avoid justice. As dawn broke over Fort Ellis, the sounds of gunfire were replaced by the methodical work of securing prisoners and tallying casualties. The criminal network that had terrorized the territories for nearly 2 years was finally broken, its leadership captured or killed, and its political protection eliminated. But even in victory, Thomas found himself thinking about the cost of their struggle. Too many good people had died before the evil was finally stopped, and too many families had been destroyed by criminals who operated with the protection of corrupt officials. The Patterson children had their justice, but it had come at a price that would mark them for the rest of their lives. Standing in the courtyard of Fort Ellis as military personnel processed prisoners and documented evidence, Thomas Mackenzie realized that his journey from suicidal despair to purposeful action was nearing its end. The children who had saved his life by giving him something worth fighting for were finally safe, and the criminals who had tried to destroy them were facing the justice they had long evaded. The final chapter of their story was about to begin, and Thomas could hardly believe how far they had all traveled from that desperate morning when he had heard children's voices crying from beneath the earth of his own pasture. The trials of Senator Harrison Morrison and his criminal network began. In the spring of 1924, 6 months after the final battle at Fort Ellis, the proceedings were held in Helena, the territorial capital, in a courthouse that had been transformed into an armed fortress to protect witnesses and ensure that justice could proceed without intimidation or interference. Thomas Mackenzie sat in the witness gallery, watching as Rebecca Patterson took the stand to testify against the man whose corruption had enabled the murder of her parents. Now 16 years old, Rebecca had grown into a young woman of remarkable poise and strength, her experiences having forged her into someone far more mature than her years suggested possible. "State your name for the record," the federal prosecutor requested, his voice gentle but formal in the packed courtroom. "Rebecca Elizabeth Patterson," she replied clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. "I am the oldest surviving child of Joshua and Martha Patterson, who were murdered by members of Senator Morrison's criminal organization on October 23, 1923. The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Rebecca recounted the attack on their wagon train, the systematic execution of her parents, and the calculated cruelty of burying 7 children alive while their parents, murderers, discussed the profits they would share with their political protector. Her testimony was devastating in its detail and unshakable in its accuracy. Senator Morrison, seated at the defendant's table flanked by expensive lawyers from back east, had aged dramatically during his months in military custody. The man who had once commanded respect and fear through political influence now appeared diminished and desperate, his eyes darting nervously between the witness stand and the armed guards who ensured he couldn't escape justice again. "Miss Patterson," Morrison's lead attorney began during cross-examination, his tone suggesting sympathy while his questions sought to undermine her credibility. "You were barely 14 years old during these alleged events, and you had suffered tremendous trauma. Isn't it possible that your memories of conversations and details might be influenced by suggestions from investigators?" Rebecca's green eyes fixed on the lawyer with a steady gaze that reminded Thomas painfully of Sarah's unwavering honesty. "Sir, when men murder your parents in front of you and bury you alive with your little brothers and sisters, you remember every word, every face, and every detail. I would give anything to forget what happened, but I can't, and I won't let you. Pretend it didn't happen exactly the way I've described." The defense attorney's strategy of attacking Rebecca's credibility backfired spectacularly as her composed responses and obvious sincerity impressed both the jury and the packed gallery of spectators. Here was a young woman who had survived unthinkable trauma and emerged stronger rather than broken. Someone whose testimony carried the weight of lived experience rather than coach statements. Michael Patterson, now 14 and bearing a striking resemblance to his father, testified about the systematic looting of the wagon train and the conversations he had overheard about dividing profits with political contacts. His engineer's mind for detail provided corroborating evidence that supported Rebecca's account while adding new information about the criminal network's financial operations. Samuel Patterson, still dealing with occasional headaches from his head injury but determined to see justice done, described the weapons he had seen in Crawford's possession and the boasts about providing modern rifles to hostile Indian tribes. His testimony linked Morrison directly to the treasonous activities that had elevated the charges from mere corruption to capital crimes against the United States. Even little Mary Patterson, now 8 years old and much more talkative than she had been immediately after the rescue, provided crucial testimony about overhearing Morrison's name mentioned during the criminals' planning discussions. Her innocent recollection of adult conversations proved that the conspiracy extended to the highest levels of territorial government. The twins David and Daniel, now 10 years old, testified together about their captivity and the systematic cruelty they had witnessed. Their synchronized accounts of shared trauma provided emotional impact that moved several jury members to tears. While establishing the calculated nature of the crimes committed against their family, Thomas found himself deeply moved by the courage these children displayed in confronting their tormentors. Each of them had grown and changed during the months since their rescue, developing into individuals with their own strengths and perspectives, while maintaining the close bonds that had helped them survive their ordeal. Eleanor Whitman, who had been appointed as the children's legal guardian during the proceedings, sat behind them in the courtroom providing silent support. Her presence had been transformative for all of them, offering the maternal guidance they needed while respecting their independence and strength. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by testimony from the surviving members of Crawford's organization, who had finally agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Their detailed accounts of Morrison's involvement in planning attacks, sharing intelligence about valuable targets, and laundering profits through his political connections, painted a picture of systematic corruption that shocked even experienced law enforcement officials. Captain Hayes testified about the military investigation and the evidence of weapons trafficking that had made Morrison's activities a matter of national security. His crisp military bearing and detailed knowledge of the case provided authoritative confirmation of the criminal network's scope and impact on territorial security. Marshal Donovan presented the financial evidence that linked Morrison directly to the criminal proceeds, showing bank records, coded telegrams, and documented payments that established his role as the political protector who made the entire operation possible. The paper trail was so comprehensive that Morrison's attorneys struggled to offer alternative explanations for the suspicious financial activity. Dr. Hensley testified about the children's physical and psychological condition when they were rescued, providing medical evidence of the systematic abuse they had suffered. His professional assessment of their injuries and trauma helped establish the severity of the crimes while highlighting their remarkable recovery under proper care. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Thomas Mackenzie himself. As the man who had discovered the buried children and organized their rescue, Thomas provided first-hand evidence of the crime scene and the children's condition when found. More importantly, he spoke about the transformation he had witnessed in 7 traumatized children who had grown into strong, resilient young people despite unthinkable suffering. "These children saved my life," Thomas told the hushed courtroom, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I was planning to end my own life when I heard them calling for help from beneath the earth of my pasture. In saving them, they gave me a reason to live again. But more than that, they've shown me what real courage looks like. They've faced their tormentors in this courtroom with more bravery than most grown men could muster. And they've done it not for revenge, but for justice, to make sure this never happens to another family." The defense attorney's strategy focused on portraying Morrison as a victim of circumstances, a politician who had been manipulated by criminal elements rather than an active participant in their crimes. They argued that his political position made him a target for false accusations, and that the evidence against him had been manufactured by ambitious federal prosecutors seeking to advance their careers. But the overwhelming weight of evidence, corroborated by multiple witnesses and supported by detailed financial records, made Morrison's guilt undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning verdicts of guilty on all counts, including treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and corruption of federal law enforcement. When the verdicts were read, Morrison showed no emotion, beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. But in the gallery, Thomas saw Rebecca reach over to take her brother Michael's hand, while Eleanor placed protective arms around the younger children. Justice had been served, but Thomas knew that the real victory was not Morrison's conviction, but the healing and growth he had witnessed in 7 remarkable young people. The sentencing phase brought testimony about Morrison's decades of public service alongside evidence of his criminal activities. Character witnesses spoke about his contributions to territorial development, while prosecutors detailed the families that had been destroyed by his protection of murderous criminals. In the end, Judge Harrison Coleman sentenced Morrison to death by hanging for treason, with additional life sentences for his other crimes. The sentence would be carried out at the territorial prison in Deer Lodge. bringing final justice for the families that had been destroyed by his criminal network. As the courtroom cleared following the sentencing, Thomas gathered the Patterson children around him for what had become their family ritual of mutual support. These young people had faced their worst nightmares in this courtroom and emerged victorious, proving that evil could be defeated when good people stood together with courage and determination. "It's really over," Rebecca said quietly, her voice carrying the mixture of relief and exhaustion. "He can never hurt anyone else the way he hurt our family." Thomas nodded, understanding that the end of the trials marked not just justice for past crimes, but the beginning of new possibilities for 7 remarkable young people who had proven that survival was just the first step toward building meaningful lives from the ashes of tragedy. The legal proceedings were concluded, but the real story of redemption and renewal was just beginning for the unlikely family that had been forged in the crucible of shared struggle against overwhelming evil. Thomas Mackenzie had found his purpose in protecting these children, and now they would all face the future together with the knowledge that love and courage could triumph over even the darkest circumstances. 5 years after the trials ended, the Mackenzie Ranch had been transformed into something Sarah would barely recognize, yet something she would have loved with all her heart. The sound of children's laughter once again echoed across the Montana valleys, but now it carried notes of joy and hope rather than the desperate courage of survivors clinging to life. Thomas stood on the front porch of the expanded farmhouse, watching as Rebecca Patterson, now Rebecca Mackenzie, having been formally adopted along with her siblings, directed the construction of a new schoolhouse that would serve not only their growing family, but the children of neighboring ranches. At 21, she had become a certified teacher through correspondence courses and was determined to ensure that education would be available to every child in their remote valley. "The foundation needs to be deeper on the north side," Rebecca called out to the construction crew, her voice carrying the same authority that had once kept her siblings alive in their underground prison. "Montana winters are harsh, and this building needs to last for generations." Thomas smiled as he recognized his own stubborn perfectionism reflected in Rebecca's oversight of the project. She had inherited not just his name, but his determination to build things that would endure, whether they were buildings, families, or communities. The transformation of the ranch had begun almost immediately after Morrison's execution. Federal authorities, recognizing that the Patterson children deserved compensation for their suffering and the loss of their parents' property, had awarded them a substantial settlement that Thomas had carefully invested in expanding their operation and establishing trust funds for each child's future education. More importantly, the publicity surrounding their case had attracted attention from families seeking the kind of safe, supportive community that the Mackenzie Ranch represented. Homesteaders arrived throughout 1925 and 1926, drawn by stories of neighbors who would risk their lives to protect each other's children and the promise of land where honest families could build better lives. Michael Patterson, now 19 and bearing the Mackenzie name, had developed into a gifted engineer whose innovations in water management and crop rotation had made their ranch one of the most productive in the territory. His technical mind, sharpened by his traumatic experiences, focused on solving practical problems that improved life for everyone in their growing community. The new irrigation system should increase crop yields by 30%, Michael reported to Thomas as they reviewed plans for expanding their agricultural operations. "And the water storage tanks I've designed will provide emergency reserves during drought years. We'll never again be vulnerable to the kind of desperation that drives people to accept help from criminals." The twins, David and Daniel, now 15 years old, had channeled their shared bond into a partnership that made them formidable young men despite their youth. David had inherited Thomas's instinct for livestock management, while Daniel showed Sarah's gift for understanding people and building relationships that strengthened their community. Samuel Patterson, whose head injury had left him with permanent Scars, but enhanced his artistic abilities, had become the community's unofficial historian and chronicler. His detailed drawings and written accounts of their experiences had been published in Eastern newspapers, helping to expose the corruption that had once threatened frontier families. "I want people to remember," Samuel explained to visitors who came to hear their story firsthand. "Not just the horror of what happened to us, but the courage of ordinary people who chose to stand up against evil." Mr. Mackenzie could have turned away when he heard us calling for help, but he didn't. That choice changed everything. Little Mary, now 13 and blossoming into a young woman with her mother's gentle spirit, had become the heart of their extended family. Her gift for nurturing younger children made her invaluable as more families joined their community and brought their own youngsters who needed the kind of patience and understanding that only someone who had survived trauma could provide. Tommy, the youngest Patterson child who had been barely 2 when they were buried alive, had grown into a healthy 8-year-old, with no conscious memory of their ordeal, but an instinctive understanding of the importance of family bonds. His innocent joy served as a daily reminder of what they had all been fighting to protect. Eleanor Whitman had become more than a guardian or housekeeper. She had evolved into the community's matriarch, the wise woman whose experience and judgment helped resolve disputes and guide important decisions. Her marriage to Thomas 2 years after the trials had surprised no one who saw how naturally they worked together to nurture their unconventional but deeply loving family. "I never thought I'd marry again," Thomas confided to Jake Morrison during one of his old hired hand's visits to the ranch. "Sarah was my first love, and I thought she'd be my only love. But Eleanor didn't try to replace Sarah. She helped me honor Sarah's memory while building something new." The ranch now employed over 40 people during peak seasons, making it one of the largest operations in Montana territory. But more than its economic success, the Mackenzie Ranch had become a symbol of hope and resilience that attracted visitors from across the country who wanted to see proof that good could triumph over evil. Federal law enforcement agencies used their story as a case study in combating organized crime and corruption, while child welfare organizations pointed to the Patterson children's recovery as evidence that even severely traumatized young people could heal and thrive given proper support and love. The legal reforms that followed Morrison's conviction had transformed territorial law enforcement, establishing new oversight mechanisms and federal coordination that made it much more difficult for criminal networks to operate with political protection. Marshal Donovan, now promoted to chief of the Territorial Marshal Service, credited the Patterson children's testimony with creating the public outrage necessary to force these long overdue changes. "Those kids didn't just survive their ordeal," Donovan observed during a visit to commemorate the 5th anniversary of Morrison's arrest. "They turned their suffering into a force for justice that has protected countless other families." That's a kind of courage that most adults never develop. The schoolhouse construction was scheduled to be completed in time for the autumn term, when Rebecca would begin teaching not only her younger siblings, but also the children of the 12 families who had settled in their valley. The curriculum she had developed emphasized not just traditional subjects, but also practical skills, community responsibility, and the kind of moral courage that had enabled their survival. "Education isn't just about reading and arithmetic," Rebecca explained to Thomas as they reviewed her lesson plans. "It's about teaching children to think for themselves, to stand up for what's right, and to understand that they have the power to make their communities better places." As autumn approached, bringing with it the anniversary of that terrible day when the Patterson family's wagon train was attacked, Thomas found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them all to this point. The man who had once stood beneath an oak tree with a rope in his hands now presided over a thriving community built on the foundation of love, courage, and mutual support. The old oak tree still stood behind the barn, but its significance had been transformed. Instead of a monument to despair, it had become a symbol of the moment when Thomas chose life over death, hope over surrender. The children often played beneath its branches, their laughter serving as a daily reminder of how dramatically their lives had changed. On the evening before the schoolhouse dedication ceremony, Thomas stood once again beneath the oak tree, but this time he was not alone. Rebecca joined him, now a young woman whose strength and wisdom seemed to illuminate the gathering darkness. "Do you ever wonder what Mama and Papa would think of how we've turned out?" Rebecca asked, her voice carrying the gentle melancholy that sometimes touched her when she remembered her murdered parents. Thomas considered the question carefully, thinking about the courage Joshua and Martha Patterson had shown in their final moments and the legacy they had left in their remarkable children. "I think they'd be proud beyond words," he said finally. "You've taken the love they gave you and used it to build something beautiful. You've turned tragedy into triumph, and that's the greatest memorial any parent could ask for." As they walked back toward the house, where Eleanor was putting the younger children to bed and Michael was working on engineering drawings by lamplight, Thomas felt Sarah's presence as clearly as if she were walking beside them. His first wife would have loved these children as her own, and she would have been proud of the man Thomas had become through his commitment to protecting and nurturing them. The schoolhouse dedication ceremony drew visitors from across the territory, including federal officials, law enforcement leaders, and families who had been inspired by the Patterson children's story. But the most meaningful moment came when 7-year-old Tommy Patterson Mackenzie rang the school bell for the first time, its clear tone echoing across the valley as a declaration that education, hope, and community had triumphed over ignorance, despair, and evil. "This is what winning looks like," Thomas said to Eleanor as they watched their children and neighbors, celebrating the completion of another symbol of their shared commitment to building a better future. Not just surviving, but using survival as the foundation for something greater. The Mackenzie Ranch had become more than a successful agricultural operation. It was a testament to the transformative power of love, courage, and community. 7 children who had been buried alive had not only survived but thrived, becoming leaders who would shape the future of their territory for generations to come. And Thomas Mackenzie, the grieving widower who had almost chosen death over life, had discovered that sometimes the greatest tragedies can become the foundation for the most meaningful triumphs. The children who had saved his life by crying out from beneath the earth had given him not just a reason to live, but a purpose worth dedicating his life to fulfilling. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in the same shades of rose and gold that Sarah had loved so much, Thomas knew that their story was not ending, but beginning anew with each child who would learn and grow in the schoolhouse Rebecca had built, each family who would find refuge and support in their community, and each generation that would carry forward the legacy of choosing love over hate, courage over fear, and hope over despair. The widowed rancher who had almost ended it all had instead found a new beginning that honored both his past and his future, proving that even in the darkest moments, there are always reasons to choose life, sometimes calling to us from the most unexpected places. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.